How can a person find justice after being wronged by a system? Imagine being convicted of a crime you didn't commit, lost in a system that betrays you and leaves you voiceless. What would you do? How can you find justice when everything seems to be against you? This is the story of a woman who, after being crushed by the gears of a flawed system, decides to fight not only for her freedom, but for something even greater: the truth. Follow her journey of revenge, redemption, and overcoming adversity, where each step brings her closer to a major twist that will change everything you thought you knew about justice. Have you ever wondered what would happen if your life were turned upside down by a lie? What if, in an instant, you were accused of something you didn't do, and all your efforts to prove your innocence were ignored? Unfortunately, for many people, this is a cruel reality. Today, we will delve into the story of Maria, a woman like so many others who, due to her humble origins, found herself crushed by a system that should have protected her, but instead condemned her to a life of suffering and injustice. Maria lived in a small town where the rich and powerful always seemed to get away with everything, while the most vulnerable were treated as disposable. She had a simple life, but one full of dreams. Hardworking, honest, and with immense inner strength, Maria never imagined that one day her fate would be decided by people who didn't even know her. The problem began when she was unwittingly involved in a crime she did not commit. One mistake, one simple misunderstanding, and the flawed and faulty system made her the prime suspect. The accusation seemed so absurd that even she took a while to believe it. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the pressure from society, the image that the media and the authorities wanted to create. Maria's social class was her greatest condemnation. If she had money, she might have had a good lawyer. If she had been from an influential family, she might have been treated differently. But since she wasn't, her path was relentlessly mapped out for her. Like so many other victims of the system, Maria was left at the mercy of a judicial process, with no interest in seeking the truth. To the court, she was just another person who didn't matter. The failure of the judicial system is something we all know about, but don't want to see. It was designed to be a balance, where justice should prevail. However, for those without resources, the balance is tilted to the wrong side. Maria's trial was riddled with errors: poorly analyzed evidence, discredited witnesses, and a public defender who was more concerned with the clock than with the facts. What was a simple accusation turned into an epic battle, where Maria had no chance, or at least that's what everyone thought. There was no room for doubt, no time for a proper investigation. Everything had already been decided. She was guilty, and nothing she did could change that. Maria, however, did not let herself be defeated. Deep down, she knew she was not guilty. More importantly, she knew that the truth must prevail. But how can you fight when everyone around you prefers to perpetuate the lie? What can you do when you are in the minority, when your word does not carry enough weight to turn the tide? Unfortunately, she was not the only one to find herself in this situation. Every day, thousands of people are condemned to live a similar nightmare, all because of a judicial system that fails to see the truth, to hear the voices of those who most need to be heard. The flaws in the system are immense, and worst of all, people often become invisible, as if their lives don't matter. But Maria did not accept the fate that was imposed on her. When the door of justice closed, she saw a window open, a window of resistance, of search for truth, and above all, of struggle. She knew that in order to survive, she would have to fight in every way possible. But how? How could she challenge such a powerful and ruthless system, where the truth is often the last thing to be considered? At that moment, Maria made a decision that would change the course of her story. She would refuse to be just another victim. She would begin to understand the flaws in the judicial system. She would begin to study, to delve deeper into the laws, to learn everything she could about the process she was involved in. She knew the fight would be difficult, but she believed that, with time, she could overturn her conviction. The key was knowledge, and the courage to challenge those who thought she was already defeated. Maria's story is not unique, and you, who follow us, have probably heard similar stories. People who, because of a simple mistake, a flaw in the system or a lie, find themselves at the mercy of an unjust conviction, with no hope for justice. But what happens when the person being oppressed decides not to give up? What happens when someone decides to fight with all their strength, even when everything is against them? The answer to that question may be more powerful than you imagine. And the journey of Maria, a simple woman who refused to accept her sentence without a fight, will show us that even in the midst of the deepest darkness, a light of hope can be born. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been through something like this, where you felt misunderstood or harmed by a system that should have supported you? How would you react if you were in Maria's place, facing a system that offers you no chance? The fight for justice, as you will see, is full of obstacles and difficult moments. But in the end, you may realize that true strength lies not in how the system sees you, but in how you decide to fight for what is right. If you are as curious as I am about what comes next in this journey of overcoming adversity, justice, and revenge, leave your like on this video to support us. And, of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming twists and turns in this exciting story. Let's understand together what happens when courage and the search for truth find their way. Maria didn't know what to expect when she was first taken to that cold, dark place, where the walls seemed to swallow any remnant of hope. When the door closed behind her, the sound of the latch echoed deeply, something that would reverberate within her soul forever. What she felt there was not just fear, but a sense of disorientation, as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Injustice is not something you experience only at the moment of accusation. It corrodes you from within, slowly, without you noticing, until the person you were no longer exists. The first blow was public humiliation. The whole town watched the spectacle of her arrest. At that moment, Maria was no longer an ordinary woman, a daughter, a friend, a worker. She was a monster in everyone's eyes. In the eyes of those same people she saw every day on the street, there was now a mixture of revulsion and curiosity, as if she were an example of something to be avoided. The whispered words on street corners, the furtive glances, the deconstruction of her identity. Every detail she saw and heard felt like a dagger in her chest. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the silence of those she loved most. When the accusation reached her family, she was received as a stain, a shame that could not be erased. The words of her relatives, once supportive, were now laden with doubt. They couldn't understand how something like this could have happened, and no matter how hard Maria tried to explain, the seed of mistrust had already been planted. Her own parents, who had always taught her to be strong and never give up, were now defeated. And Maria? She felt like she was the only person in the world who still believed in her own innocence. How can you keep the faith when even those you love most begin to turn away? Prison was a merciless place. At first, Maria tried to maintain some sanity by focusing on the little things. The sunlight shining through the bars, the momentary tranquility during the few hours of silence. But she soon realized that this was just a facade, an illusion of security. The weight of the accusation made everything heavier, more unbearable. With each passing day, she saw the hours dragging on, and the doubt of everyone around her was reflected in her own thoughts. What if I am really guilty? What if I am dreaming of an innocence that never existed? These questions became her daily companions, whispering in the darkness of her mind. It was no longer just about the accusation. It was about trying to maintain control of her own sanity. And then came the memories, the incessant thoughts of what her life had been like before all this. She remembered the peaceful days when she would get up early for work, with a simple but genuine smile on her face. She remembered the plans she made for the future, the conversations with friends about dreams, travels, and new opportunities. Every piece of her life now seemed like a distant movie, something that had been taken from her without warning, without reason. Worst of all was the emptiness it caused, as if, by being torn from her old life, she had also been torn from her identity. Who was she, really? The woman accused of a crime she never committed, or the woman she had always been? The days inside the prison were all the same, an endless repetition of empty faces, meaningless rules, and indifferent looks. She saw other women around her, many of them with stories more tragic than hers, but all with something in common: the feeling that their lives had been stolen. Each of them bore, in some way, the marks of an injustice that was not their choice. Maria began to wonder if there would ever be a day when she could look back and see her life before this accusation as something real, something that could be recovered. She felt that she was slowly losing herself, in pieces that even she could not put back together. The psychological impact of it all was not long in coming. Sleep was the first thing she lost. The nights, once peaceful, were now filled with nightmares. She would wake up sweaty, her heart racing, trying to remember what had happened to destroy everything like this. When she closed her eyes, she felt herself back in court, hearing the words of the sentence, seeing the impassive expressions of the judges. The faces of those who judged her became distorted figures, but the weight of their words still echoed in her ears. The injustice had contaminated her so much that even moments of peace became a burden. And, as if that weren't enough, the pressure on her body and mind began to affect her health. She felt inexplicable pains, tremors, an exhaustion that seemed to go beyond the physical. She no longer knew if it was the weight of the accusations or the weight of living with the constant doubt of who she was now. Maria's mind was being torn apart inside, while the world around her simply moved on, as if nothing had changed. That was when something inside her broke, not from sadness or pain, but from anger. An anger that was no longer directed at the system, nor at the people who had made her suffer. It was anger at herself, anger at the weakness she found herself sinking into, at the way her own history was being erased. And it was at that moment that Maria did something no one could have imagined. She no longer accepted being a victim. She no longer accepted the idea that somewhere, her life was being determined by decisions she never had a chance to make. This was the beginning of a change, an awakening. Maria would fight against everything and everyone to rescue not only her freedom, but her dignity. She knew that the road would be long, full of pain, and that the scars would be eternal. But she also knew that the greatest injustice of all would be to allow the lie to win. And now, Maria was no longer alone. She had the most important thing, her truth. And you, who are with us now, have you ever stopped to think about the impact that injustice can have on your life? How it can change everything you know, everything you believe? What would make you fight when the pain seems unbearable? When the system around you seems to fail completely? When darkness seems insurmountable? There is one thing that no one can take away from you: your mind. Maria's mind was on fire, no longer with the anger of before, but with a deep, almost desperate desire to understand what had happened to her. She no longer cared about the looks of reproach, the words of condemnation. In that prison with high walls and small windows, where the hours seemed to lie drag on like heavy chains, she found something that could set her free: knowledge. At first, Maria didn't know where to start. No lawyer would listen to her. No books could explain the legal maze that held her captive. But it was during one of those long afternoons when the silence of her dungeon suffocated her that something unexpected happened. She found a small, almost forgotten library with some old editions of law books. They weren't the best books, nor the most comprehensive, but for Maria, they were like a beacon in the darkness. At first, she understood almost nothing of what she read. The legal terms were like a foreign language, and the references to the Constitution and criminal codes seemed like an insurmountable wall. But something inside her was ignited. She began to realize that if the system had been able to destroy her, perhaps there was a way to use it against itself. The idea of justice she had always known was just a facade. True justice, she began to realize, was much more complex, often manipulated by those who had the power to control the laws. But there was still a loophole, a crack where she could slip through. Every book she devoured, every paragraph she tried to understand, made her feel like she was beginning to regain control of her own story. The knowledge she gained was not just about the laws, it was about the entire system. She learned that what happened to her was not an accident. It was a reflection of a flawed system, full of loopholes and contradictions, which often left the weakest behind. Over time, Maria delved deeper and deeper into the codes of defense, into the jurisprudence that could be used to overturn her sentence, into the appeal processes that had previously seemed distant and inaccessible to her. She began to understand how lawyers manipulated terms to their advantage and how authorities used people's fear and ignorance to make them accept their fallacies. Gradually, her mind became sharp, able to see beyond the surface of the accusations, understanding not only the case against her, but also the dirty game that was going on. Behind the closed doors of the courts, the nights were the most productive times. During the day, she was just another prisoner, but at night, when the lights went out and silence fell over the prison, she became a tireless student. As time passed, Maria began to write notes, scribbling on dirty pieces of paper, creating a defense outline that made her increasingly excited. She knew that her only chance of getting out of that cell would not be through exhaustion or giving up, but through her ability to dismantle, piece by piece, what they had done to her. But what she did not expect was that her quest for knowledge would begin to change not only her view of the system, but also the way other prisoners saw her. At first, she was just another woman lost in a sea of injustice. But as the other prisoners began to hear her conversations about the law and her questions about the judicial process, Maria became a kind of reference point within the prison. They saw in Maria a flame of hope, something they themselves had lost. Some of them even began to ask for help, wanting to understand more about the system that had imprisoned them. Maria, who was once just a victim, was now becoming a source of knowledge and strength, a reflection that even within those walls, it was still possible to fight. But the path was not easy. The search for knowledge, as much as it gave her strength, also brought with it a new sense of loneliness. The system had isolated her from everyone, and now even the few people with whom she shared her journey seemed distant. It was as if she were on a lonely journey to find the key that would open the prison doors, and meanwhile, the world outside continued on its course, indifferent to her suffering. Maria knew this was only the beginning. With every book she read, every law she understood, every code she deciphered, she felt a weight lift from her heart. But she also knew that if she really wanted to overturn her conviction, she would have to go. Further, the knowledge she acquired was not enough just to understand the flaws in the system. She needed to use it, apply it, transform herself into something more than a studious prisoner. She needed to be someone capable of turning the tables, of challenging the very foundations of a system that, until then, had seemed invincible. And that was when Maria made a promise to herself. She would become a master of law, an advocate for the oppressed, someone who would not only have the right words to defend herself, but who could also fight for others like her. She knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time since her conviction, she felt she was in control, that life still had something to offer. Those books weren't just dusty pages. They were her passport to freedom, her way back to dignity. And more than that, they were the tools with which she could tear apart the fabric of lies that had been sewn around her. Now think for a moment. When everything around you seems to be falling apart, where do you find strength? How do you find clarity amid the chaos? And more importantly, do you think you would be able to rewrite your own story, just as Maria began to do, even when all seemed lost? Maria knew she couldn't fight alone. Despite her new mastery of the law, She soon realized that the battle she faced was much greater than she had imagined. The system was not only complex, but also relentless, with its sharp gears ready to crush anyone who dared to challenge its power. But when you are surrounded by shadows, even the faintest light can be salvation. It was in this dark environment, within the prison walls, that Maria began to find others like her. People who, in some way, had also been victims of the machine she was trying to understand. The first significant encounter took place on a muggy summer afternoon. Maria was sitting, absorbed in her law books, when a woman with a strong gaze, but marked by pain, approached her. Her name was Anna, and she had been imprisoned for years, convicted of a crime that, like Maria, she had never committed. Anna was the kind of person who didn't talk much, but her silence spoke louder than words could express. She had an aura of resistance, as if she had accepted the pain, but never surrendered to it. Anna watched Maria from afar, noticing her immersion in books, her determined gaze, and the fire that seemed to burn within her, something that seemed lost to many of the prisoners. Maria felt Anna's gaze on her, but initially didn't pay much attention. She was used to the suspicious looks from the other prisoners, who saw her as a threat, or simply as someone who had become different. But Anna's gaze was different. When the woman approached and spoke, her voice was soft, but carried a strength that Maria still couldn't fully understand. "You think you can change that, don't you?" Anna asked, pointing to the books. "I tried to at first, but systems aren't made to be broken. They're made to crush, to swallow up anyone who tries to fight." Maria looked at her, not knowing how to respond. She didn't want to sound arrogant or naive, but in her heart, she knew Anna was wrong. "I have to try," was all she said. Anna, for some reason, smiled softly, as if something inside her had been touched by Maria's determination. In the days that followed, they began to talk more often. Anna, who had seemed distant, began to open up to Maria about her own suffering. She told her about the system that had condemned her, about the false evidence and corruption that had been present at every stage of the judicial process that had led to her imprisonment. She was not the only one. There were many other people in that place who were there for mistakes that the system would never admit. Anna's stories echoed in Maria as a reflection of her own pain, but also as a beacon. She was not alone. Over time, Maria realized that Anna was not the only one. There were others there, like Rodrigo, a man who had been imprisoned for over 10 years for a crime he had never committed. Rodrigo's story was even more disturbing. He had been convicted for being the shadow of a crime that never happened, an unfortunate coincidence that imprisoned him without any solid evidence. His story was full of judicial flaws, mistakes that the system would never correct. But he, like Anna, was not someone who gave up easily. He had tried countless times to reverse his situation, and although the results were always in vain, he continued to study, continued to seek a chance. It was then that Maria realized something she hadn't seen before. She wasn't fighting this battle alone. All those years of loneliness and suffering had created something that no one could take away from her, an invisible network of allies, people who shared the same pain, but also the same determination. Together, they began to discuss ways to confront the system, to identify loopholes in their convictions, to study ways to challenge the harm, manipulated evidence, to seek evidence that, until then, had been ignored. Maria became part of a small group within the prison. Anna, Rodrigo, and a few others began to meet night after night to study, discuss, and formulate strategies. These were secretive meetings, where each person brought something new, a book, an idea, a strategy. The knowledge Maria had acquired about the system now mingled with the life experiences of everyone there. Together, they were no longer just prisoners. They were people with a common goal, with a mission to rescue their lives from the clutches of a system that seemed unbeatable. What happened next was something Maria could never have imagined. Those meetings began to expand. More and more people began to join them, attracted by the idea of justice they were trying to build. by the opportunity to finally understand how the system worked and, perhaps, how to bring it down. Each new person who joined the cause brought with them a story, a different perspective, something that would further enrich the group's knowledge. They were slowly becoming a force to be reckoned with, and this did not go unnoticed. But with allies also came enemies. Prison authorities began to realize that Maria and her group were more united than ever, more organized, and more prepared to confront the system in a way that no one had dared before. The guards became more vigilant, looking for any sign of rebellion. The tension grew with each meeting, and the pressure increased. But Maria knew there was no turning back. Her journey was not just about her. It was about all those who shared the same pain, the same search for truth. Among the allies, a mutual trust arose that only adversity could forge. Maria was no longer alone. She knew that, alongside these people, she could finally challenge the system that had imprisoned her. Each of them, with their stories of pain and resistance, was now part of her fight for revenge and justice. The network of allies was small but powerful. They were more prepared, more informed, and more united than ever. Maria knew the battle would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she believed there was a real chance of victory. And that victory, more than personal, would be a collective victory. The struggle for freedom for each of them was now intertwined, and none of them were willing to give up. Now stop and think. How many times in your life have you felt alone in your struggle? What if, instead of isolating yourself, you could find other people who shared your pain, your goals, and your will to fight? What would you do with that collective strength? Maria's prison was no longer just a physical place. It had become a battlefield, where her mind had become the only weapon capable of defeating the system. But now she knew that her struggle was not just for herself. The pain she carried within her extended far beyond her own suffering. Over the months, as she delved deeper and deeper into law, books, and discussed cases with her new allies, Maria realized something profound. She couldn't fight just to regain her freedom. She needed to fight for all those who, like her, had been crushed by the system. All those who had been wronged, condemned not only by the charges against them, but by the very structure that was supposed to protect them. They needed her. Maria now understood the true nature of her journey. It was no longer about revenge, although anger still burned in her chest. It was no longer about proving that she was right, although her innocence was the fuel for her fight. It was about justice. It was about breaking the cycle of oppression that imprisoned thousands of people like her. People who, for some reason that no one could explain, had been discarded by the system. When she began to talk more deeply with her allies, Ana, Rodrigo, and the others, she realized that corruption in the judicial system was a much more complex reality than she had imagined. Each of them had a story. Each of them had been sent to prison through fallacies, lies, and manipulation. But the most striking thing was not just the suffering they faced. The most touching thing was the lack of any hope, the absence of a clear path to redemption. They were, in fact, forgotten by everyone, condemned without any visibility for the flaws in the system that imprisoned them. Maria couldn't allow this to continue. She couldn't be just another victim. She couldn't leave this prison and forget what she had learned. Forget the faces of the people who, like her, were losing their lives within those walls. She had to act. And to act, she knew she had to expose the fraud that the system, with its facade of justice, was hiding. But the task would not be easy. It wasn't just a matter of proving her own innocence. It was a matter of bringing down an entire system. A system that operated with lies disguised as truths. A system that favored the rich, the powerful, and the corrupt. Maria knew the risks. Exposing the truth would mean a target on the backs of everyone who supported her. It wouldn't just be a legal battle. It would be a war against those at the top, those who kept the machine of injustice running. But at the same time, she knew she had no other choice. What would happen if she remained silent, watching the people around her being treated with the same contempt she had been? What would happen if she left prison and went on with her life, ignoring what she knew about the system that would destroy more lives? Maria couldn't live with that burden. She had to fight. That's when she began gathering information. She knew that the flaws in the cases against her and the other prisoners were not simple mistakes. They were, in fact, a reflection of a system that fed on fallacies to keep itself running. She began to gather evidence, to study police reports in detail, the fraudulent evidence that had been used to convict her and so many others. The gaps in the investigations began to open up before her, and with that, the truth began to emerge, like a force that could no longer be ignored. With each discovery, Maria felt a strange sensation. It was as if she were crossing a threshold between physical imprisonment and an even deeper mental imprisonment. Each piece of truth she unearthed felt like a cry for freedom, but at the same time, it felt like an even heavier burden. She knew that by exposing these scams, she was not only putting her own life at risk, but the lives of everyone involved in the fight for justice. But with every moment she spent there, inside that dark and oppressive world, something inside her grew stronger. It was as if she had found her true mission, no longer to fight for herself, but for the freedom of all. That's when she had an idea. Gathering the evidence, she began to form a strategy. She would not limit herself to a simple legal appeal. Maria wanted more. She wanted to publicly expose the fallacies, bring the injustices to light, and thereby generate a movement that could, perhaps, destroy the system from the inside out. She knew she had an advantage. The system was so secure in its own impunity that it would never imagine that a simple prisoner, without a voice or resources, could be capable of dismantling its structure. Maria now knew how to use it against itself. With the help of her allies, she managed to channel her quest for justice into a greater purpose. Ana, Rodrigo, and the others became her biggest supporters. They were her army of courage, ready to fight alongside her. But Maria also knew she had to be cautious. Exposing the system would not only be a matter of bringing evidence to light, but of understanding the consequences it would bring. She needed to be strategic, calculate her steps, and above all, ensure that her truth was not buried again, as so many others had been before her. Throughout her journey, Maria learned that redemption was not just an end, but a constant process of reinventing herself, of not falling into the traps of the system. She no longer fought for physical freedom, but for the freedom of her soul, for the certainty that her voice would be heard, and that alongside her allies, she could expose what was hidden in the shadows of justice. And so, Maria's path to redemption would not be easy, but she was willing to face any obstacle. Her struggle was not only to change her life, but to give voice to those who were silenced, to give hope to those who were losing the battle before it even began. Maria now understood. True justice does not come from the top down, but from the inside out. The struggle was hers, but at the same time, it belonged to everyone. Now I ask you, have you ever had a moment in your life when you realized that your struggle was not just about you, that by helping others, you were also helping yourself? What would you do if you had the chance to challenge a system that oppresses you? What if, by fighting, you could find your true redemption? Maria knew there was no more room for hesitation. The road ahead would not be easy. In fact, she understood that she was just beginning to blaze a tortuous trail, full of risks and obstacles that could crush her. But at the same time, she knew that every step she took brought her closer to freedom, truth, and finally revenge. Not blind revenge, driven by anger, but calculated, intelligent, and above all, fair revenge. Now, with the knowledge she had acquired, the prospect of regaining control over her life seemed clearer. Maria's first move was a masterstroke, a strategic move that would change the course of her battle. She knew that the key to reversing her situation was not only to try to clear her name, but to use the weaknesses of the system itself against it. The flaws in the judicial processes, the manipulated evidence, the discredited witnesses, all of this now became the foundation on which she would build her defense and her strategy for revenge. With the help of her allies, Ana, Rodrigo, and the other prisoners who had become more than friends, but true comrades in arms, Maria began to review every detail of her case. With each error, each inconsistency in the documents, she began to put another piece of her puzzle together. Every small slip by the authorities was now an opportunity. When the flaws in the system were gathered into a meticulously organized dossier, Maria knew that the time to act was approaching. That's when she made her first move. She used one of the principles she had studied most, the review of evidence. She knew that the evidence that had been used to incriminate her was, in fact, manipulated. She had proof that the investigation had not been conducted fairly, that there were omissions and distortions in the witness statements. With this in hand, she sought out lawyers who could still be influenced by her in some way. But it couldn't be just any lawyer. Maria knew she needed someone willing to face corruption head-on and take risks to expose it. With the support of a corrupt lawyer who had not yet been completely corrupted, Maria began to take the first steps to use the system against him. The lawyer was surprised by her determination, but when he saw the amount of information and the clarity of her defense, he couldn't help but recognize that there was something he himself had lost: his faith in justice. They began to devise a plan. Maria knew that this partnership would not be perfect, but it was enough to lay the first stone. The big challenge, however, was to move the pieces without the authorities noticing. They needed to act quickly because at any moment, Maria could be punished for subversive actions or accused of trying to reverse her situation illegally. She knew that if she made any bold moves, she could be crushed before she had a chance to explain. But that's when she remembered what she had learned during her long nights of reading. The system is based on trust, on the certainty of its own impunity. Maria couldn't be direct. She had to be sneaky, slow, strategic. The first big move came when she used her new legal skills to pressure the prison administration itself. She discovered that one of the guards was involved with one of the corrupt lawyers, and she cleverly used this to her advantage. By gathering evidence of this involvement, Maria planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the authorities, creating a crack in the wall of trust that had been built between the guards and the lawyers in the system. This not only destabilized some of the forces she needed to neutralize, but also created a situation where the authorities themselves began to view each other with suspicion. Little by little, she weakened the pillars surrounding her conviction with immense patience. Maria was beginning to see the power of information and manipulation. Now she knew that the real battle was not only in court, but in the shadows. She played the system's game, but with her own rules. She never lost her integrity. She knew she couldn't fall into the temptation of acting out of pure revenge, because that would make her as guilty as those who had wronged her. She wanted justice, and justice doesn't come through brute force, but through strategy, intelligence, and the ability to understand where and how justice had failed. With each move, she became bolder, more precise. Maria began to infiltrate meetings, to communicate with more influential people who could somehow help her. She used the fragility of the system to her advantage, creating alliances, obtaining valuable information, manipulating loopholes with surprising skill for someone who had started out as a simple prisoner, all with one goal: to bring down those who, over the years, had built a system of oppression and injustice. She knew she was still far from achieving her complete revenge, but every small step was a victory, a silent but immensely powerful victory. And as time passed, Maria felt that power was slowly changing hands. She was no longer at the mercy of the system. She was now someone who held the reins of her own story, someone who, with a strategic move here and there, could begin to dismantle everything that imprisoned her. The game was just beginning, and Maria was ready to show that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in physical struggle, but in the power of the mind and the courage to challenge a system that believes itself to be invincible. Now I ask you, has there ever been a time when you needed to be more strategic than direct in your struggle? When did you feel that strength was not the answer, but intelligence and planning? If you were in Maria's place, what would be your first step? The day had finally arrived. Maria could feel the tension of a great event in the air, the weight of every decision she had made, the pressure of knowing that, at that moment, the truth she had been pursuing was about to be revealed. She didn't know exactly how it would all happen, but she knew there was no turning back. The courage she felt within herself was fueled by the truth, by her determination to expose, once and for all, the flaw in the system that had imprisoned her. This was not just any trial. It was the battle of a lifetime, not only for her freedom, but for justice that should finally be restored. Maria was ready to face her oppressors. The moment she had studied so much, that she had anticipated so much, was finally materializing before her. The courtroom was packed, the room filled with expectant glances, as if everyone were waiting for the outcome of this long story. The judges, as always, seemed unperturbed, their faces impassive, almost as if they didn't care what was really at stake. But Maria knew she was preparing for something that could change everything. The first to speak was the prosecutor, as arrogant as ever, his voice full of conviction, completely ignoring the flaws in the case. He began to present the old charge against her, the same charge that had been repeated so many times before, and which, until then, seemed to be an indisputable verdict. "The case is closed," he said with a confident smile, as if the evidence could not be contested, as if the mistakes made during the trial were of no importance. Maria felt her heart pounding, but her mind was calm. She knew that his words were only the beginning. That was when her moment arrived, the moment when she would stand up and face, once and for all, the system that had crushed her. With the courage she had left, Maria asked permission to speak. The judge, surprised, looked at her as if she were an intruder, an unwanted person in that space. But he gave a brief nod, allowing her to speak. The silence in the room was deafening. With a firm voice, but filled with an unshakable sense of justice, Maria began to reveal what she had discovered. She no longer spoke as a prisoner. She spoke as someone who knew exactly where the flaws were, as a person who understood the system and was now ready to show the world how it fed on the pain of others. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here not only to ask for my freedom, but to show what the system has done to me and so many others who have been torn from their lives, condemned without a chance to defend themselves. Throughout this process, what I saw was a game where the truth never had a chance. What I saw was justice that was not fair, an investigation full of fallacies, manipulated evidence, witnesses who were never heard. What I saw was corruption acting behind the scenes, like a shadow that erases any trace of truth." Maria's words resonated in the courtroom, and for a moment, she felt that the weight of her voice was causing even the judges to look at her differently. She continued to expose every flaw in the process, every mistake that, at that point, could no longer be denied. The prosecutor tried to interrupt her, attempting to discredit her, but Maria did not give in. She had been preparing for this moment for months, if not years, and she would not allow herself to be silenced again. She didn't just talk about her case. Maria took the conversation to a deeper level. She began to talk about the system as a whole, about how legal loopholes were used by those in power to benefit themselves, about how the lower class was systematically punished, while the powerful and wealthy managed to escape any charges. She not only pointed out the flaws in her specific case, but also brought to light the corruption that permeated the entire judicial process, and how it harmed not only her, but so many other people. Every word that came out of her mouth was a blow against the structure that had imprisoned her. Every sentence was like a sharp blade, cutting through the false image of impartiality of the system. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Not a silence of indifference, but a heavy silence, almost as if everyone were digesting the weight of those words. Maria had exposed the truth so clearly, so unquestionably, that even those in charge of the system could not ignore what she had just said. She looked the judge in the eye, not with fear, but with unshakable confidence. The prosecutor, clearly disconcerted, tried to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. What Maria had done was not just present evidence. She had exposed the very essence of injustice, something that could not be erased. The judicial system was faced with a choice: ignore the truth or confront it. Maria had already done her part. She knew that what happened next was beyond her control. But by speaking out, she knew she had struck the first major blow against a system that thought itself invincible. And then, when the judge announced a recess so that the defense and prosecution could meet, Maria felt something unusual. It was not relief, nor happiness. It was the feeling that she had finally achieved what she had been seeking: the chance to give a voice to those who could never speak. She knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The system was now in conflict with the truth, and that meant that Maria's battle, though dangerous and unpredictable, was closer to being won than it had ever been. What would you do if you were in Maria's place? When the time comes to confront injustice, would you have the courage to expose the truth, even knowing the risks? When lies and corruption dominate, how do you fight to give the truth the space it deserves? The sound of the hammer echoed through the courtroom, breaking the tense silence that hung in the air. When the words "not guilty" were pronounced, Maria felt a wave of relief, but also a sense of emptiness. It was not a simple victory, not a happy ending in the way she had imagined when she began her journey. She had found the justice she had been seeking, but something inside her had changed, profoundly transformed by the experience she had gone through. The real victory, she realized, was not just in the favorable sentence or her regained freedom. It was in something greater, something that could not be measured by words, but that reverberated within her as an undeniable truth. Maria was finally free, but she would never be the same person who had entered that courtroom years earlier. The judicial system, despite being a tool of oppression for many, had also shown her something she had never imagined: the strength that lies in resilience, in the fight for truth, and in the courage to do what is right, even when the whole world seems to be against you. And as she rose from her chair, feeling the weight of victory in the battle she had fought, something more powerful arose within her. Maria knew that her true mission was not over. Her struggle did not end with her own freedom. She was now armed with something no one could take away from her: the wisdom that comes from overcoming adversity, and the power to inspire others to also challenge the injustices they face. Those who saw her as a victim, a fallen person, now saw her differently. Maria was no longer a prisoner of the system. She was a symbol of resistance, someone who had been crushed but rose up to fight, using her knowledge, her courage, and her determination. She knew that real change would not come only from within the courtroom, but through the people who, upon seeing her story, would find the strength to fight for more equitable justice, for a more fair system. She had not only defeated the prosecution, she had given a voice to those who, like her, had never been heard. Maria reflected on what she had been through and everything she had learned along the way. She realized that, over the years, her real enemy had not been just the system, but disillusionment. The biggest obstacle to justice is not corruption or lies. It is the belief that there is nothing that can be done to change things. Maria's real victory was not her sentence of freedom, but the fact that she had found the power to turn pain into action, to turn defeat into strength. She had won because she never lost hope, because she never gave up fighting for the truth. Now, with freedom in her hands, Maria knew that her mission was greater than herself. She needed to use her experience to help others, to be the light she herself had wished to find when she was in the dark. Her true legacy would be to show the world that, even in the face of the greatest adversity, the fight for justice is never in vain. With her story, she would inspire those who were still behind bars, those who were lost in a system that seemed impossible to challenge, because she knew that true victory was not a favorable sentence. It was the fight for change, for transformation, and for the truth that, in the end, always finds its way. Maria looked to the future with a sense of peace, but also with renewed determination. Her battle did not end there. The system may have fallen, but the work of rebuilding, of truth, of justice, was just beginning. She was not only free, she was ready to be the change the world needed. And with that thought, she smiled. A quiet but definitive victory, not for her own freedom, but for the freedom of all those who still fight for a system that truly protects them. If this story touched you in any way, if you believe that justice, courage, and truth can indeed transform realities, then be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this message, because together we can inspire more people to fight for a more just world. Your voice can also be the key to change. Let's continue this journey of transformation. And remember, true victory begins when we don't give up fighting, no matter how difficult it may be.